Hi everyone, thanks for coming out today. I am really honored to be able to welcome Dr. Nasser Hussain to talk to all of us today. Dr. Hussain is an assistant professor of anthropology at the New College in Florida, where he also directs the Civil Discourse Initiative, and he founded the Culture and Politics Lab. I had the opportunity to have him come visit my undergrad class yesterday, and so he shared a bit of his story with us. And as he described it, he grew up as a blue-collar kid outside of London, whose life changed dramatically when he got an invitation from one of our colleges to attend for free, and that was Harvard. He went there undergrad before then going to Columbia to earn his PhD in anthropology. Since then, he's been the fellow and director at all sorts of fancy institutions and schools. He studies and teaches at the crossroads of anthropology, political theory, and moral philosophy. And specifically, he explores how individuals and communities pursue meaning, virtue, and belonging in an age of fragmentation, something that I know probably everyone here is interested in. That's probably why you're here today. I met Dr. Hussain when I attended a faculty seminar at Duke, where he was my teacher. And this was a seminar to bring faculty in to learn how to teach students about civil discourse. And Nasser was one of my teachers. He was outstanding. I learned an awful lot from him. And I'm privileged now to be able, thanks to the Institute, to be teaching the class that he taught me how to teach here at University of Toledo. And so I'm excited to welcome him, and I'm looking forward to him teaching all of us something today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Greg, and thank you for the invite, and I'm really glad to be here, and thank you all for coming. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the free lunch. Just remember, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and for us anthropologists, it's all about exchange and reciprocity. So we're locking the doors now, and you're stuck with me for the next hour. So the topic I want to explore today is what happens when certain ideas become untouchable, when our classrooms, the very places meant for curiosity, start to resemble temples of purity. I've called this talk American Taboos, Teaching the Unspeakable in Higher Education. Anthropologists and social theorists have long sought to make visible what societies take for granted, to turn the invisible into anthropological fact. Early anthropologists, writing about Polynesian islanders, described people who believed that certain objects, words, or actions were too dangerous to touch. These social prohibitions, or taboos, signaled both danger and sanctity, something set apart because it is either too sacred or too threatening. For these early anthropologists, cultures organized around taboos were notably different from modern cultures, such as ours, predicated as they are on ideas of freedom and openness. In his classic essay, Body Ritual Among the Nasserima, anthropologist Horace Minor described the strange and elaborate customs of a tribe whose rituals centered on the body, cleanliness, and social display. Only later does the reader realize that Nasserima is American spelled backwards. Minor's point was simple but brilliant. If one looks at one's own culture through an anthropological lens, even the ordinary appears exotic. And thus anthropology's gaze, once fixed on distant cultures, eventually turned inward. Disavowing any sense of superiority, anthropologists began to use concepts like taboo to understand the moral order of their own societies. For every culture has its taboos, even those that call themselves secular or modern. Indeed, early anthropologists would find our modern universities fascinating field sites. Over the past decade, lay anthropologists, i.e. members of the broader public, have begun asking a similar question. What on earth is going on in our universities? For our own discourse, especially within the academy, feels more constrained by taboos than ever. In a polarized society, the language and insights of anthropology may help us make sense of our new tribal loyalties and the taboo dynamics that now shape higher education itself. So, in this talk, allow me to play the role of native informant, offering an insider's account of a peculiar tribe, thereby answering the following questions. What are America's taboos? What are the forbidden questions and the unspeakable topics of our time? And what do they reveal about who we are and what we fear? How do these taboos both originate within universities and become shaped by the politics outside of them? For a now polarized age, what is considered taboo in one tribe might not be classified as such in another. To answer these questions, let us first turn to how some of the most prominent thinkers in the humanities and social sciences have thought about taboo. The sociologist Emil Durkheim argued that every society is organized around a fundamental dualism, the sacred and the profane. Taboos in this sense are not exotic relics, but universal features of social life. They maintain the sacred by keeping the profane out. Consider the Muslim cab driver lowering the volume of the music on his radio as he passes a mosque. He removes his shoes before entering that mosque or his home, or the cultural association of the right hand with purity and the left with impurity in his daily conduct. These are not arbitrary customs, but symbolic boundaries, ways of organizing space, behavior, and belonging. When those boundaries are crossed, disapproval quickly turns to moral alarm. Even when traditional religion declines, the sacred does not disappear. It simply migrates. We still inhabit a moral order organized around the distinction between the sacred and the profane, Durkheim absorbed. Only these symbols have changed. Secular societies too possess their own sacred values, and violations of those values can provoke the same moral outrage that once greeted blasphemy. Modern taboos no longer guard against physical contamination, they guard against moral contamination. Language or ideas perceived to violate moral boundaries. In Durkheimian terms, when someone breaks a taboo, says the wrong word or asks the wrong question, the community unites against them in ritual outrage. Twitter mobs, I still call it Twitter X, got to make that correction next time. Twitter mobs perform moral purification ceremonies. Public apologies serve as acts of atonement. To break a taboo is to risk expulsion from the moral community. Building on Durkheim, the eminent anthropologist Mary Douglas asked a deeper question. How and why do societies mark some things as pure and others as impure? For Douglas, purity and pollution were not relics of primitive religion, but expressions of social order itself. Purity meant that things were in their proper place. Pollution arose when categories blurred or boundaries failed. Dirt, she famously wrote, is matter out of place. It is the byproduct of a systemic ordering and classification of matter, insofar as ordering involves rejecting inappropriate elements. Douglas's insight was that what counts as a purity is not universal, but contextual. Everyone universally finds dirt offensive, but what counts as dirt depends on the classification in use. What is taboo in one society may be trivial in another. A public kiss might scandalize one culture and pass unnoticed in another. Indeed, sexual taboos are themselves often referred to as dirty. Taboos functioning as mechanisms of boundary maintenance tell us who or what does not belong. Our pollution behavior, Douglas explained, is the reaction which condemns any object or idea likely to confuse or contradict cherished classifications. Inappropriate ideas, sometimes inappropriate people, must be filtered out to preserve the system's coherence. In that sense, taboos are not marks of irrationality, but of rational organization, signs of how power orders the social world. As Douglas warned, the taboo-maintained rules will be as repressive as the leading members of society want them to be. These makers of opinion, educators, publishers, journalists, and now arguably big tech platforms, define what may be spoken and what must be silenced. Criticism will be suppressed, Douglas observed, as whole areas of life will become unspeakable and, in consequence, unthinkable. Yet when those same arbiters desire a new moral order, the taboos themselves will shift. If Douglas was right that taboos reflect the power of those who define the moral order, then modern universities offer a particularly revealing field site. For much of modern history, they have been the institutions most responsible for determining what counts as legitimate knowledge and acceptable speech. College professors and administrators have acted as moral gatekeepers, shaping not only what is thinkable, but what is unspeakable. Once imagined as neutral spaces of inquiry, universities have become among the primary engines of moral classification in American life. And so to understand America's taboos today, we need not look to remote islands or ancient rituals, but to our lecture halls and seminar rooms. What today is considered sacred on campus? What words are off limits? What questions too dangerous or too impolite to ask? What are the symbols we must handle with ritual clear? To explore these questions, I turn to the ethnographic, to my own experience navigating higher education. My encounter with the taboos of American academia began fittingly enough as a student. In the mid-2000s, political correctness was already a defining feature of campus life. I remember the excitement of arriving at Harvard, each term eagerly thumbing through the course directory, expecting the very best of a liberal arts education. The topics promised adventure and insight, but when classes began, that excitement quickly met its limit. The classroom, as I experienced it, was a moral theater, full of unspoken rules about what could and could not be said. The courses felt sanitized, the discussions restrained. Students bright and ambitious seemed afraid to speak freely. Many were complicit in what I came to think of as a game, mastering the performance of political correctness to secure a high GPA and a coveted internship. The C word, as it were, had become taboo, not conservative, but class. Ironically, this taboo on class had once served a creative purpose. In The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, the economist Benjamin Freeman argued that America's very classlessness, its aspiration to upward mobility, was itself an engine of prosperity. By keeping class out of polite conversation, American culture sustained the illusion of equal opportunity and, for a time, the motivation to pursue it. The taboo of class, in other words, was once productive. It made ambition and movement possible. Coming from Britain, I found that difference unmistakable. In Britain, class is everywhere, heard in accents, seen in clothing, felt in manner and bearing. It marks neighborhoods, schools, even the way people queue or greet one another. In America, by contrast, class is harder to locate. It is less visible in daily life, yet it quietly organizes ambition and belonging all the same. There was, however, a visible and beautiful reminder of class on the Harvard campus. John Pomeroy, known affectionately as Doc, a working-class Irish-American nearing retirement who worked nights as a security guard in my dorm Dunster House. So that's one of the handouts you have is an article I wrote in the Harvard Crimson describing my relationship with Doc. Doc, in his own way, proved that Bill Buckley might have been onto something when he said he'd rather be governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston phone book than by the Harvard faculty. Doc and I would often talk late into the night. It was through those conversations that I first learned what real education meant. Boston, with all its history and character, became the perfect backdrop for his late-night tutorials. I listened to him more closely than to any professor. He had no fancy credentials to brandish. He'd gone back to school on the GI Bill at UMass Boston as a mature student, but he had wisdom, the kind that comes only from living a full and complicated life. As a cultural outsider from a blue-collar background on the Harvard campus, I recognized something kindred in him. We talked about life and all the burning issues of the day, about how race had entrenched itself in Boston's neighborhoods and their histories, about religion, especially Islam's encounter with the West, about social mobility. It was through Doc that I first learned of the Moynihan Report and even the Piaget-Vygotsky debate in educational psychology. Nothing was off the table. Our conversations were raw, curious, and completely unpretentious. An open exchange between two people searching for truth without fear of saying the wrong thing. Of course, we sometimes stepped on each other's toes, but we always gave one another the benefit of the doubt. My classmates, meanwhile, observing my conversations with Doc, would give me puzzled looks, as if to say, why is he wasting his time with the security guard? But in truth, those evenings were an important part of my Harvard education. They shaped not only my thinking as an anthropologist, but my sense of what it means to be a whole person. Doc's wisdom was not theoretical, It was lived, rooted in experience and clarity. To be a whole person, I came to realize, is to let one's knowledge, conscience, and character speak with the same voice. It is to think freely without becoming cynical, to hold convictions without becoming rigid, and to meet the world with both curiosity and courage. A whole education in that sense does not simply train the mind, it enlarges the soul. Doc reminded me that intelligence and integrity belong together, and that wisdom begins not in knowing more, but in becoming more human. When I left Harvard for graduate school in anthropology at Columbia University, Doc and I kept in touch. We spoke often, even as the culture on college campuses began to shift. Around 2011 and 2012, political correctness took on a new form, more aggressive in its enforcement, yet subtler in its reach. I saw firsthand how taboos multiplied, not through official rules, but through unspoken expectations and social cues that everyone was expected to know. Universities, once admired as bastions of free inquiry, increasingly became governed by cultural taboos around harm and offense. Temples of reason were beginning to function as temples of purity. Professors acted as a kind of priesthood, guarding orthodoxy through syllabi, peer review, and institutional norms. The syllabus itself became a sacred text. Trigger warnings emerged as modern-day taboo signs, cautioning that the sacred or dangerous lay ahead. Speech codes operated as purity laws, designed to keep contamination at bay. Even humor, that last refuge of irreverence, became suspect. A rigid orthodoxy took hold, and postmodernism had become less about expanding knowledge than about controlling it. Ironically, I had left political science for anthropology, hoping to find open-minded discussions about culture and difference. Instead, I found more taboos, now only dressed in new academic language. And in some disciplines, anthropology not least among them, the culture of taboo took a particularly insular form. Known for its cliquishness, it often empowered students to appoint themselves as moral arbiters, speaking not only for their peers, but sometimes in place of the professor herself. As Douglas noted, when the makers of opinion desire a new moral order, the taboos themselves will shift. Over the past decade, that shift has been unmistakable. Gender identity activism and what some critics called gender ideology emerged as a dominant force shaping the moral boundaries of campus life. New buzzwords such as discursive violence and epistemic violence began to circulate, marking dissenting viewpoints as threats. The result was a culture in which words themselves came to be treated as dangerous, where challenges to identity, whether racial, sexual, or gendered, were experienced as forms of symbolic harm. What once belonged to religion had migrated to the secular academy. The fear of pollution of saying the wrong thing began to replace the search for truth as the guiding spirit of higher education. Intersectionality, initially conceived as a tool for understanding overlapping forms of inequality, gradually hardened into a moral hierarchy, a filtering mechanism through which gender and identity politics could shape fields far beyond their original scope. In practice, that meant certain voices were treated as more authentic or pure than others. A queer black student's concerns might be privileged over those of a heterosexual or cis black student. And once again, class was largely absent from the conversation. In fact, it had been replaced by euphemisms like inequality or precarity that often obscured more than they revealed. By the mid-2000s, a new kind of taboo emerged, one that united liberals and conservative alike in discomfort. A public figure who embodied a style and energy that polite society found unsettling. Crude, aggressively masculine, defiant, perhaps even working class in disposition. I think you could guess who that is, right? I won't break the taboo here, just for the sake of unity in the room. But what struck me most was how one individual could become a symbol of moral pollution across ideological lines. Even those who claimed to oppose moral absolutism reacted with ritual purity tests, distancing, denunciation, symbolic cleansing. We may not burn incense in our classrooms, but the ritual logic remains. Purification before participation. Passing through a liberal arts education became a kind of rite of passage, and the diploma a token of tribal membership. Diversity statements, solidarity marches, and public denunciation served as rituals of renewal, reaffirming belonging by excluding what is deemed polluting. Those labeled toxic, unsafe, beyond the pale are not simply disagreed with, they're treated as contaminants whose very presence threatens the purity of the institution. Over time, the proliferation and enforcement of prohibitions transformed the entire campus, not just its classrooms, but its culture. The effects were felt by everyone: professors, students, even the workers who kept the place running. Cancel culture, as it came to be called, did not stop at the faculty lounge. Even beloved security guards found themselves its targets. A few were dismissed after complaints that their words had made students feel unsafe. Meanwhile, the moral politics that once animated a few marginal humanities departments became mainstream. A new alliance of professors and students, convinced of their moral vocation, began to exercise a quite formidable authority over campus life. The culture of taboo and self-censorship was everywhere, polite, pious, and paralyzing. In such an environment, rules of avoidance flourish. Every teacher knows the moment when the classroom falls silent, not from ignorance, but from fear. A discussion that might have been lively becomes reverent, cautious, even anxious. If universities are microcosms of the American social order, they are also laboratories of formation. The ideas sanctified on campus often become the moral currency of the wider culture. Indeed, this new culture of censorship and self-censorship reshaped not only the university, but the national mood. The optimism of an earlier America had given way to grievance and victimhood, to what I can only describe as a loss of vitality. What ought to be one of the richest, most formative time in a person's life, college, has come to feel, for many, like an ordeal. Increasingly, ordinary Americans are beginning to question its worth. As universities forge a new moral consensus through modern forms of sacredness and taboo, the question then is, what kind of order do these taboos protect? Is it an order animated by curiosity, openness, and care, or one governed by conformity and fear? Contemporary taboos, often cloaked in the language of justice or safety, perform an ancient task: to separate the clean from the unclean, the sayable from the unsayable. But if education becomes merely a ritual of cleansing, it loses what it made it sacred in the first place: the vitality that comes from daring to think, to question, and to imagine freely. Through it all, Doc kept me grounded. We questioned the new dogmas not in hostility but in disbelief, and more often than not, his plain-spoken realism cut through the fog of jargon. He reminded me that the promise of a liberal arts education had once been for intellectual freedom, the freedom to discuss, to debate, to doubt. In his old-school, blunt Bostonian way, Doc would give me what he called a dope slap, a reminder to stay anchored in the real. And when there was pressure on me to leave the PhD program for refusing to conform to this new orthodoxy, I made him a promise that I would see it through to the end. My friendship with Doc gave me the confidence to keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep teaching in that same spirit. Free from Columbia's constraints, I found my footing again during my time as a lecturer and postdoctoral fellow at Princeton, which Greg referred to. When I began teaching, I wanted to recover that sense of vitality, that spirit where ideas could still breathe. My classroom, I decided, would not be temples of purity, but workshops of curiosity. The goal was not to avoid offense, but to think together, to take risks in language and imagination, and to trust that disagreement need not mean enmity. In a culture increasingly anxious about contamination, the classroom could still be one of the few places where we practice the art of thinking out aloud, of speaking freely, listening generously, and discovering in the process how our convictions take shape. I designed a course called American Identity at a Crossroads, first taught in the fall of 2021, the year after George Floyd's death. The course had been 10 years in the making. Its syllabus was shaped as much by those late-night conversations with Doc as by any academic training. We explored the big questions facing America: class and social mobility, religion and race, gender and sexuality, and America's place in the world. On the first page of the syllabus, I included a joint statement signed by two professors who have long inspired my work, Robert P. George and Cornel West, on truth-seeking, democracy, and freedom of thought. And that's one of the other handouts that you've got today. We read Tocqueville, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, Malcolm X, Adrienne Rich, and Christopher Lasch, whom incidentally I first discovered through another Harvard security guard, Paul Barksdale. I invited speakers from across the political spectrum, from socialist Chris Hedges to libertarian George Will, to show that disagreement need not mean enmity. Teaching's taboo subjects, I found, demands balance, representing the best arguments on all sides. The result, overflowing classrooms. Students came not because the course was safe, but because it was alive. When the material is honest and alive, students respond. The hunger for open discussion is still there, as I saw again in another politically charged course I taught in the fall of 2024 at Duke University. That course, the presidential election, drew such high demand that we had to open a second section. Students from across the political spectrum told me that they'd never been so free to speak before. What I learned beginning with Doc Pomeroy all those years ago was simple. When you treat people seriously, when you invite them to speak honestly, without fear of moral contamination, they rise to the occasion. That's what education is meant to do. Indeed, education, I've learned, doesn't require transgressions for its own sake. That's important. My goal is never to shock or provoke, but to notice what a culture treats as untouchable and to ask why. In that sense, teaching the taboo is less about rebellion than reflection. It's a way of helping students find a language for difficult truths without the defensiveness of self-censorship or the moral comfort of self-righteousness. So what's lost when college professors avoid certain subjects because they seem too dangerous to touch? While I can point to large enrollments in my own courses, the broader appetite for open inquiry has migrated elsewhere, to podcasts, YouTube, and online forums. I sometimes tell my progressive students, if we were having these conversations where they belong, in the classroom, maybe those right-wing podcasters wouldn't be so popular. Because it is in the classroom, unlike on social media, where real dialogue can happen, the kind that requires patience, empathy, and the courage to listen. In our increasingly atomized culture, that kind of face-to-face engagement has never been more valuable. And I often point to, I'm going to keep mentioning this, but I often point to the classic film 12 Angry Men to illustrate the point where the jurors in that film deliberate over the fate of a young man accused of murder, and they slowly work through their biases and assumptions. And that room, if you think about it like a good classroom, it becomes a space of transformation, like where the ideas are tested and emotions are tempered and the understanding. It struck me as deeply ironic that academic disciplines like anthropology, fields once devoted to understanding difference and giving voice to the marginalized, now often reproduce the very hierarchies they claim to critique. They speak endlessly about the lack of cultural capital that keeps ordinary people from elite spaces, yet their own new prohibitions, policing language, gesture, even tone, have made those spaces more exclusionary than ever. Those who can't perform the latest cultural cues are quietly excluded, even when they possess intelligence, insight, and moral seriousness. Such limitations discipline the mind into conformity. They train students to see curiosity as risk and to avoid the very questions that education was meant to confront. And that, I think, cannot be good for American democracy. The irony is that the university was once the ultimate safe space, not because ideas were shielded from challenge, but because they could be tested without fear. It was the one place where students were trusted with complexity. Unlike, say, the corporate workplace, where talk of religion or politics is politely off limits, the university was where such conversations belonged. The assumption, one that ennobled higher education, was that both students and professors had the maturity to wrestle with hard truths. The purpose of education is not to abolish taboos, but to turn them into opportunities for reflection. To study one is not to violate it, but to understand its moral logic, how it shapes meaning, community, and belonging. When we examine, for example, Muslim prohibitions on pork, or the dietary laws of Jews, Hindus, or vegans, the goal is not transgression, but comprehension, to see what such boundaries reveal about the sacred in everyday life. True education, then, lies not in the absence of taboo, but in the wisdom to engage boundaries thoughtfully. The classroom should not be a sanctuary from difficult questions, but a training ground for encountering them with honesty and grace. Anthropology reminds us that every culture, including our own, is defined as much by its taboos as by its ideals. The task of the teacher and the citizen is to face those boundaries without fear, to ask what they protect and what they conceal. So Mary Douglas wrote that ideas about separating, purifying, demarcating, and punishing transgressions have as their main function to impose system on an entirely untidy experience. Perhaps the task of education is the opposite, not to impose order, but to help us live intelligently within life's untidiness. The sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, once observed that any intellectual activity derives excitement from the moment it becomes a trail of discovery. In every field of learning, Berger wrote, discovery means finding worlds previously unthought and unthinkable. When such discovery is pursued with passion, a widening of awareness, sometimes even a transformation of consciousness, occurs. The universe, Berger reminds us, turns out to be much more wonderful than one had ever imagined or dreamed. And in that wonder, we begin to see anew the very world in which we've lived our lives. Can anthropology then offer a positive vision of higher education, one beyond the cynicism and nihilism that so often haunt the human sciences today? I believe it can. In the ritual process, Victor Turner gave us two enduring concepts at the heart of ritual life: liminality and communitas. Liminality is the threshold, the in-between space where the ordinary social order is suspended, where hierarchy and status dissolve. In that suspension, uncertainty and experimentation flourish, and out of it arises a rare and powerful sense of connection, what Turner called communitas. College, seen through this lens, is itself a liminal space, a rite of passage. Students step away from their familiar worlds, enter a period of uncertainty and change, and eventually re-emerge with a new sense of self. The diploma marks that transformation symbolically, but the real achievement lies deeper: the formation of a person capable of reflection, courage, and dialogue. At its best, higher education is a temporary republic of equals, a place of play and discovery, where new ideas can be tested without fear. If we can recover that spirit, seeing the university once more as a site of genuine liminality rather than bureaucratic orthodoxy, then education can again become what it was always meant to be: a ritual of transformation, not indoctrination, a passage toward maturity, not conformity. From an educator's perspective, the classroom can be a catalyst, a space where curiosity confronts fear and truth demands courage. If we dare to speak of what was once unspeakable, the classroom becomes a space and a model for genuine exchange across difference. The very kind of exchange I had once had in those long conversations with Doc. So to conclude, teaching taboo subjects allows students to participate meaningfully in public life, cultivating the habits of mind and character that sustain a democracy. Every time a student says, "We can't talk about that," the anthropologist in me can't help but notice that we've stumbled onto something sacred. And it's there, in that uneasy silence, where the real education begins. Thank you so much. Okay, to answer the first question, no, absolutely, and we have a very divided society and culture, and what may be, as I think I made the remark, what may be taboo on one side is just doesn't really matter so much on the other. And the interesting point from let's just look at this from the educator's perspective, because it's about teaching taboo in higher education. So what happens then if you have, say, both conservative and liberal students in your classroom? Well, I think the job of the educator then is not to cater to either of those sides. It's going to be somewhat unsettling, So there is going to be points, and it happens in my classrooms, where both liberal and conservative students say, oh, that makes me a little uncomfortable, right? And that's the beauty of education. So within the specific communal dialogue of each, what's taboo? That's what I'm saying. No, okay. But in education, according to the classically liberal principles, we go there, right? So, and I agree with you, yeah. So on the first point. The second point about, well, I think this is just because of the centrality of education in what can only be described as this kind of latest iteration of America's culture wars. And it's become, universities are seen as the kind of primary institutions of, from the conservative perspective, more so for like woke indoctrination and to one-sidedness. And so the reason why we have this overreach, but what I'm arguing is that, hopefully we can get back to reclaiming what the university for a while was about, at least formally. Now, it wasn't perfect, it was aspirational. But I do remember a time where we didn't have this kind of anxiety or fear and such a kind of ideological slant on campuses. Yeah. Yeah, and I think, the medical profession has an oath and, to conduct oneself. And I think from the teachers and particularly at a higher educational professional, an important part is that we should strive for balance, because we should accept that there's going to be a range of students from different backgrounds in that classroom. And I just think it gets very boring as an educator in any case, towing an ideological line. It's not the point and the function of a classroom in any case. Interestingly, what I've observed in recent years is often universities were held accountable for kind of a one-sided, the word you use, indoctrination, right? But nowadays, when students arrive on campus, they're already all set in with their views that they sometimes want confirmed, interestingly enough. So there is a connection there. The university is not the only space where I think we could try to get more authentic and dialogue and a pursuit for truth. And of course, it starts K through 12, yeah. So. Practice, and finding people you disagree with. And that's often it can be outside of even the classroom if those opportunities don't avail themselves, but finding folks who you disagree with and having conversations with them. And that's how to kind of train those muscles. And that's a good way of putting it. And I think that's a fantastic observation, because I think I had these kind of two channels of knowledge dissemination, and I was very lucky in this kind of like informal education with Doc. But the point is, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need to, it can't just miraculously appear. Like I think the first time I was doing this kind of teaching these courses, I think I was somewhat nervous. I was taking a risk, but it takes practice and training. So hopefully there's people in your life or in college that who do think differently, and engaging them in a conversation puts you into, I think, a better spot. Because in some sense, you're then modeling what you're teaching to your students.
More risks.
That's a good question. I think it's very important to do it right at the start of the term, start of the class. Your first class is the most important class. If you lay the kind of ground rules, then, like I said, I include the statement on truth-seeking and open inquiry, freedom of speech. So we go through that with the students. I also, give a little bit about my own kind of history with this. And so one of the things is I mentioned, look, these things are complex. We might, what would serve us well is a little humility, because a viewpoint you cherish or hold dear today might not be the case in a couple of years' time, because we gather more information, we become wiser. So, but I do think it is as simple as that. Laying the ground rules early, I think kind of like saves a lot of trouble. And I think the students on the whole are on board then. And I think what also is, I really have a balanced syllabus, right? I'll give you an example. So, I try to balance the text to incorporate a range of intellectual legacies, and I think I mentioned some of those names in the presentation. But I was asked by a student at Duke, if we can have a guest speaker who's just so happened to have worked under, I'm going to break the taboo, the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, who was visiting the Duke campus. And this was when I'm teaching a class, the presidential election. And this student who's the chair of the, he's like a small group of maybe three, he's chair of the kind of college Republicans at Duke, right? And he was in the class, and he said, look, we had invited this guy who worked for the first Trump administration, and he's had a pretty senior role. And listen, we're talking about this stuff in class. Why don't we have him sit in? And I love having guest speakers. It kind of makes things interesting, and students appreciate it. And I've been very fortunate to have Pulitzer Prize winners, all kinds of Joyce Carol Oates came to my class, like big names have come. But this occasion I declined. And the reason being is that would mean I would have to arrange for a guest speaker of a similar level on the other side to balance it. From someone who had maybe worked from the Biden administration, because when you have this kind of a charged classroom and this contentious climate, when you strike that balance, it's important. And I didn't have the time to arrange a guest speaker from the other side. So I think that's that, and I think the students on the whole appreciate that attempt to strike a balance. Yeah. First of all, as a good anthropologist, I actually like to go into the field site and observe and be in the seriously, that is how I do inform my positions, and I wasn't there, right? And so I don't have enough of the kind of like the field data that I would like. But this is another, so this is an interesting, relates to your question, because this is now seen from, say, left or liberal leaning students, that there's another taboo that we can't talk about on campus, and this is the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so now, when it comes to the protests and kind of encampments, that's a separate issue from the discussions and having open discussions about the topic itself.
But aren't they connected?
Well, they are somewhat connected, but institutions do have rules, and we do have also laws. So if there was folks who were breaking either of those, so again, like my concern is more in the classroom. Okay, and I would make sure that we have a very open discussion about it in the classroom. So obviously then there's the overextension, say, of the administration now about what folks putting pressure on some of the schools of what they should be teaching in the classroom. That's going to be that's problematic. That's an issue, because again, that then that goes against the kind of the provocative thesis of my presentation itself. And look, campuses have, this isn't new. Campuses have always been sites of protest, right? But we do have boundaries, right? And if those are violated, there's the reports coming from Colombia were that there was an overreach from the protesters. And there would ordinarily be a kind of, there's going to be like, does this contradict of the official policies of the university? That's different from because the thing is, the universities themselves, formally, they say we're all about freedom of inquiry.
But that's not true.
Right, and that point, yeah, I myself made that point, right? So formally, the universities themselves, so I'm concerned with making sure that universities stick to their standards in the classroom.
Yeah, so as I understand it, you taught a class on the 2024 presidential election during the election. Could you tell us, did you have diversity of viewpoint among the students? How many students? And how did it go? Because I think we all were there, right? And not in your classroom, but we all went through this. And it was a time where there wasn't a lot of dialogue about that core important national issue across lines. And did you see it? Did it happen? Did it work? Could you tell us more?
I think the class after the election result was the one where there was a lull and silence, and I think about probably like 70% of the students were, lean Democrat in that class. 30% were kind of Republican, and most of them had some sort of attachment because they wanted to take this class and just because of the nature of what's our kind of tribal today, someone's choosing a side. So that was the kind of balance, I'd say 70 to 30. And overall, again, the discussions were pretty respectful. And I think that the only time where there was maybe just the uneasy silence was after election day, the first class. And part of that was, I think, there was an I wasn't surprised at all because I was following the election closely, and in fact, even the students came, all right, you predicted everything to a T. The demographics, this is what this was going to go, the 6 swing states. In fact, I earned a lot of their respect after the election, just in terms of like how I had been following the campaign. So it was actually, I think it was more maybe the disappointment of some of the students and how much they had invested. And I think also just we should have a little bit of understanding of that, because, and again, just going back again to the question you raised, that's not a bad thing. I mean, I don't know so much about the administration side, but I'm arguing against kind of bureaucratic orthodoxy and this kind of sanitized college environment. You want students to care about this stuff, right? And you want them, students, universities have a long history of rich activism, and it's part and fabric of the modern university in America. So, you don't want to, I don't think, stifle that, but it has to be done in a proper way which respects the rules of the university. That's what I'm saying, right?
Yep. Thank you.
What do you have to say?
Well, lots of folks have been writing and have their thoughts on social media and the impact on our society, where you can have small sound bites and there's no real dialogue. And, look, it's there, and you're not going to be able to kind of, cancel it, eradicate it, or, I think some of these are tougher questions. They're different sorts of questions. So, first of all, if we do what we do really well, that's important. That's number one. Whatever is going on social media, but if we do what we do really well, that's number one, in the classroom. But I think, some of this stuff, look, it's like Jonathan Haidt, if anyone's familiar with him, his work, at some point now, I think they've already started doing this, and they're taking phones from young folks in particular out of the classroom, and they're moderating the amount of time folks have on TikTok. And this is a complex thing, because that's the role of families and parents, because it's not something that educators, but there's no doubt about it, because it's what TikTok and social media do is it's sound bites, and it's kind of gotcha moments. And it goes back to kind of one of the questions up there about, this takes training. It's a training of it's kind of like a monastic discipline, if almost, where it's like going to a gym, but it's for the mind instead. And you accumulate certain habits over time, and obviously TikTok is a competitor, yeah, and not a healthy one, I would say, yeah.